October 1945. Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. The war was over, but its echoes rolled across the fields of the American testing range like the sound of distant thunder. Parked under a low gray sky stood a row of foreign tanks, spoils of a global conflict that had reshaped the modern world. A captured German Tiger loomed like a crouching predator, its thick armor scarred by shell impacts. Nearby, a Soviet T-34 sat in stark contrast, smaller, rougher, its steel welded with visible seams, the green paint faded from months of use. American officers, engineers, and ordnance specialists walked among them, clipboards in hand, measuring, comparing, and taking notes. They were not looking at trophies, they were studying the future. Captain Robert H. Keller, an ordnance engineer who had spent the war testing American Shermans and Pershings, watched as a T-34 was hauled onto a flatbed for examination. He had read reports from the Eastern Front, how this tank had stunned the Wehrmacht in 1941, how it had appeared suddenly from the forests near Smolensk and turned the tide of battles where the Red Army had once been routed. The T-34, he knew, had become a kind of legend, part engineering marvel, part symbol of industrial endurance. Yet up close, it didn't look like a legend. It looked crude. Weld seams uneven, vision slits narrow, interior cramped and bare. And yet that same crude machine had outlasted the most technically advanced tanks of its time. Keller knew there was something in that paradox worth understanding. The comparison that would dominate tank warfare studies for decades was born that autumn on the proving ground: the Sherman, the Tiger, and the T-34. Three different machines representing three very different philosophies of war. In America, tank design was driven by logistics, mobility, and mechanical reliability. The M4 Sherman was not built to duel enemy armor head-on. It was built to reach the battlefield, fight effectively in numbers, and stay running under almost any condition. It was a tank for a global war fought across deserts, jungles, and cities. American commanders believed in combined arms, artillery, infantry, air support, so the tank was one tool in a larger system, not the centerpiece of destruction. In Germany, design was guided by engineering perfection and tactical superiority. The Tiger and Panther were crafted with precision, the products of a nation obsessed with technical excellence, even at the expense of practicality. They were formidable weapons, capable of destroying enemy tanks at long range, but they demanded high-quality steel, meticulous maintenance, and fuel supplies that Germany could scarcely provide in the later years of the war. And then there was the Soviet Union. The T-34 did not emerge from a philosophy of perfection. It came from necessity, a recognition that survival in total war meant producing not the best tank, but the right tank. It had to be fast enough, strong enough, deadly enough, and above all, simple enough to mass produce and repair in the field. It was not designed for luxury or comfort. It was designed for war on an industrial scale. To understand how the T-34 earned its reputation, one must strip away the myths. Western observers often described it as revolutionary, but in truth, it was the product of deliberate, pragmatic evolution. In the 1930s, Soviet engineers under Mikhail Koshkin and Alexander Morozov had studied global trends in armor and mobility. They saw that the future belonged to tanks that could move fast, strike hard, and survive counterfire without being overly complex. The earlier BT series tanks, based loosely on American designer J. Walter Christie's suspension, offered speed but thin armor. The T-26 light tank, which fought in Spain, proved too fragile against modern anti-tank guns. The T-34 was meant to bridge those worlds, the mobility of the BT with the survivability of a true medium tank. What emerged was something entirely new for 1940. A tank with sloped armor, a diesel engine, wide tracks, and a gun powerful enough to destroy almost any enemy it met during the early years of the war. Western observers were astonished when they first encountered it. In 1941, German tank crews faced the T-34 with disbelief. Their 37mm and short-barreled 50mm guns couldn't penetrate its armor from the front. General Heinz Guderian himself wrote in frustration about the shock of facing an enemy machine that outclassed his own in both mobility and protection.
But for the Soviets, this wasn't about creating shock. It was about survival.
The invasion of June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa, threw the Soviet industrial and military system into chaos. Thousands of tanks were destroyed in the first weeks, but the design philosophy of the T-34 began to show its deeper strength. Unlike German tanks, which required fine machining and specialized parts, the T-34 could be built by semi-skilled workers in relocated factories deep inside the Urals. The steel didn't need to be polished. The welds didn't need to be pretty. A rough tank that fought was worth 10 perfect tanks that existed only on paper. As American engineers examined the T-34 in 1945, they were struck by how every feature spoke to this brutal logic. The sloped armor wasn't decorative. It was a calculated balance between weight and protection. The diesel engine wasn't a luxury. It was a safeguard against catastrophic fires. Even the minimal internal space reflected a doctrine where crew comfort was secondary to mass production and battlefield effectiveness. The T-34 didn't care if its crew was comfortable. It cared if the tank could fight another day. Keller's notes from that period, like those of many ordnance officers, show a kind of respect born not from admiration of sophistication, but from understanding of purpose. The T-34's controls were rough, its vision limited, its optics inferior to German or American standards, but it was enough, and enough on the Eastern Front meant survival. When compared to the M4 Sherman, the differences were philosophical as much as technical. The Sherman was designed for global deployment, its parts interchangeable, its systems refined for maintenance ease, its ergonomics friendly to long operations. The T-34, by contrast, sacrificed refinement for production speed. A Sherman's gearbox was smooth, its turret rotation powered. A T-34's controls required physical strength. Its steering was demanding, its visibility poor. Yet when the two met on the battlefield, such as in Korea, where Soviet-built T-34-85s fought against American M4A3E8 Shermans, the contest often came down not to which was the better machine, but to tactics, crew training, and combined arms coordination. The Tiger and Panther, on the other hand, represented the opposite extreme. They were masterpieces of metallurgy and engineering, but at a cost. The Tiger weighed 54 tons, twice that of a T-34, and required frequent mechanical attention. Its overlapping road wheels clogged with mud and ice on the Eastern Front. Spare parts were scarce. Recovery vehicles struggled to tow damaged Tigers off the field. For every Tiger lost in battle, several more were abandoned or destroyed by their own crews due to breakdowns. The T-34, by contrast, could be repaired with basic tools. Crews cannibalized parts from wrecks, welded plates in the field, and returned to battle within hours. In war, perfection is often the enemy of victory. The T-34 embodied that truth. At Aberdeen, American engineers noted the simplicity of the T-34's manufacturing techniques. One report described it as an example of design efficiency for mass production under duress. The armor composition, rolled homogeneous steel angled to deflect rounds, achieved protection equivalent to much thicker plates on the Sherman or Panther. Its wide tracks distributed weight so effectively that it could maneuver through mud where heavier tanks bogged down. And its diesel engine provided both range and reduced fire hazard, something American tankers envied deeply after witnessing gasoline fires consume Shermans in North Africa. But there were limits. In terms of crew communication, optics, and internal safety, the T-34 lagged behind Western standards. Soviet doctrine accepted high crew attrition. Western armies did not. Soviet crews often operated without radios, relying on flags or visual signals, which limited tactical flexibility. In contrast, nearly all American tanks were radio-equipped, enabling coordination that the Red Army often lacked early in the war. Yet when fighting a war of attrition stretching thousands of miles, the Soviet model, mass, momentum, and replacement, proved brutally effective. By 1945, over 57,000 T-34s had been built. No other tank design in history, except perhaps the post-war T-54-55 family, would reach such numbers. It was the machine that in many ways won the ground war in Europe, not by being perfect, but by being present everywhere in overwhelming force. That fall, as Keller finished his inspection report,
He wrote one simple line that seemed to capture the essence of the entire war. The T-34 is not a great tank by our standard, but it is a great tank for their war. It was an observation that transcended national pride. In that one sentence lay the entire contrast between how America, Germany, and the Soviet Union had fought. Each designed machines that reflected their societies, their industries, their resources, their expectations of human life and endurance. The Sherman was the tank of an industrial democracy, the Tiger of an engineer's battlefield ideal, and the T-34 of a nation fighting for its very survival. And as post-war engineers drove these machines across the proving grounds, testing their limits, listening to the rattle of armor, the grind of treads, the roar of engines, they weren't just studying metal. They were studying philosophy cast in steel. The choices a society makes under pressure are written not in words, but in the machines it builds to survive. In the years leading up to World War II, tanks were not simply machines, they were statements. Each nation built its armored forces according to its worldview, its geography, its economy, and the kind of war it believed it would have to fight. The United States entered the war with an industrial confidence rooted in mass production and mobility. Its military planners viewed warfare as a logistical puzzle. If you could move men and machines anywhere, keep them supplied, and replace losses faster than the enemy, victory would follow. That was the heart of the Sherman's design. It was the tank of a country that expected to project power across oceans, maintain a consistent supply line, and rely on a team of air, naval, and ground assets working in concert. Germany, meanwhile, approached tank warfare as an extension of its engineering culture. Every German vehicle, whether the Tiger, Panther, or even the earlier Panzer III and IV, was the product of precision craftsmanship. The goal was battlefield dominance, not manufacturing ease. German doctrine emphasized tactical excellence, outflanking, coordination, and the destruction of the enemy at the point of contact. Their tanks were tools of a war of annihilation, designed for decisive tactical victories rather than strategic endurance. The Soviet Union saw war differently. Its vast geography, its underdeveloped infrastructure, and its experience of invasion forged a doctrine centered on endurance and replacement. The T-34 was not built to last forever. It was built to last long enough. Soviet planners expected tanks to burn, break, and be replaced. In the Red Army's brutal arithmetic, survival of the system mattered more than survival of the machine. At first glance, these philosophies might seem to reflect moral differences, but they are more accurately reflections of circumstance. The U.S. could afford a tank that prioritized crew safety and comfort because it had access to enormous industrial capacity and stable logistics. Germany, constrained by limited resources and ideology, sought technical superiority as a multiplier for dwindling numbers. The Soviet Union, devastated by purges and industrial backwardness, needed a design that could be made quickly and driven by men who had never seen a tractor before, let alone a tank. The T-34's design team under Mikhail Koshkin and Alexander Morozov understood this context instinctively. In the late 1930s, they toured factories, tested prototypes, and observed combat lessons from Spain and Khalkhin-Gol. They concluded that the future belonged to tanks that could move fast, endure punishment, and fight in vast, unpredictable terrain. The tank's armor would be sloped, not for aesthetics, but for survival. Its engine would run on diesel to reduce fires. Its tracks would be wide to handle mud, snow, and dust. Every design choice reflected a grim understanding. The Soviet Union would never fight short wars.
By contrast, the American M4 Sherman was conceived as part of a larger machine, a component in a vast ecosystem of industrial and logistical superiority. American tank crews were trained to work as part of combined arms teams. They expected air cover, artillery support, and recovery vehicles ready to rescue damaged machines. The Sherman's design reflected those expectations: a reliable engine, a roomy interior, and a mechanical simplicity that made it easy to repair or modify. The US didn't need a tank that could defeat every enemy vehicle one-on-one. It needed a tank that could be everywhere, all the time. German engineers had no such luxury. Under immense pressure from both military command and the Nazi regime, they aimed for tanks that embodied tactical perfection. The Tiger I was built like a cathedral, its thick armor machined with precision, its 88mm gun a masterpiece of lethality. But each Tiger consumed the resources that could have produced several Panzer IVs. The Panther, often cited as Germany's most balanced late-war design, still required far more labor hours than a T-34. For every Panther that rolled off a German line, the Soviets were building 4 T-34s. Numbers alone don't win wars, but they shape them. The German army learned this the hard way. In 1941 and 1942, when it faced the first waves of T-34s, it was clear that technical superiority could not offset the imbalance in production. A tank that takes weeks to build is useless if the enemy can replace his in days. The difference extended beyond factories. It was ideological. The Soviet Union saw war as total. Every citizen, every factory, every field was part of the front line. Soviet propaganda glorified the worker as much as the soldier, and the T-34 was the physical link between the two. It was designed so that workers with limited tools could weld its armor, so that farmers turned soldiers could drive it after brief training, and so that repair crews could patch it together with salvaged parts. It was not elegant, but it was enough. In America, design philosophy revolved around comfort, sustainability, and efficiency. When U.S. crews entered captured T-34s in 1945, many were shocked by what they saw inside. No padding, crude welds, levers stiff and heavy. It feels like a farm tractor, one tester wrote, and in a way it was. But that simplicity was its strength. American doctrine aimed to preserve men and machines. Soviet doctrine aimed to preserve the system.
The same principle applied to optics and visibility. American tanks had advanced periscopes and vision blocks. German tanks had excellent optical sights, often produced by Zeiss or lights, precise but expensive. Soviet tanks, by comparison, had rudimentary optics, functional but crude. Their philosophy was that the battlefield would always be chaotic, visibility limited, and survival uncertain. A slightly worse gun sight mattered less if you could field 3 tanks for every one of the enemies. Even the choice of steel composition reflected these divergent approaches. German armor was meticulously hardened, offering great resistance, but at the cost of brittleness when poorly treated. Soviet armor, while less refined, often absorbed impacts better under repeated stress. American metallurgy balanced the two extremes, uniform, reliable, but not exceptional. In short, the Soviets made armor that worked well enough, the Americans made armor that worked everywhere, and the Germans made armor that worked perfectly, until it didn't. The human dimension of these philosophies cannot be overstated. In the United States, tank crews were trained extensively and expected to survive multiple battles. In Germany, elite crews were trained to mastery, but were increasingly irreplaceable as the war dragged on. In the Soviet Union, crews were trained briefly, often just enough to drive and fire, because the expected lifespan of a tank in combat was measured in weeks. The T-34's simplicity allowed for that grim efficiency. Levers, pedals, and systems were arranged so that a man with little technical background could learn to operate the machine after a few days of instruction. This was design as strategy. Every feature of the T-34 spoke the language of attrition: wide tracks to survive terrain, sloped armor to multiply thickness, a diesel engine to minimize fire risk, and mechanical simplicity to maximize survival in chaos. In contrast, the German Panther spoke the language of precision: interlocking armor plates, a high-velocity gun, and a complex transmission that demanded expert care. The Sherman, meanwhile, spoke the language of logistics, standardization, modular parts, and ease of transport. When engineers at Aberdeen studied the T-34 after the war, they admired its elegance through simplicity. The report concluded that the T-34 represents a triumph of practicality under duress. It wasn't that the Soviets didn't understand more advanced engineering. They simply understood that such luxuries were irrelevant when fighting for national survival. A tank's design is a mirror of the nation that builds it. The Sherman was the child of Detroit, built on assembly lines that could produce cars, planes, and tanks with equal ease. The Tiger was the offspring of a perfectionist culture that believed quality could overcome quantity.
And the T-34 was the product of a state that believed endurance was the ultimate weapon.
By 1943, these philosophies met in direct confrontation at Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. The German Panthers and Tigers entered the field like armored gods, but many broke down before even reaching the fight. The T-34s, crude and plentiful, weighted in defensive belts, repaired overnight, refueled by hand pumps, and sent back into battle. The outcome was not decided by who had the better tank, but by whose system could sustain the fight longer. And that was the essence of the philosophical divide. America built tanks for global war, Germany built tanks for decisive war, and the Soviet Union built tanks for endless war. By the end of 1945, American officers understood that lesson deeply. The T-34 had proven that simplicity and mass could be a strategy as powerful as precision. It was a revelation that would quietly influence Western tank design for decades. The post-war American M26 Pershing and later the M48 and M60 all carried echoes of that philosophy. Sloped armor, diesel power plants, and simpler production lines became part of the conversation. Every nation had entered World War II with its own vision of the ideal tank, but by its end, one truth had become clear. The ideal tank is not the one that performs best on paper, it is the one that wins wars in the real world. War, in its most brutal simplicity, is an engineering problem. The tank, perhaps more than any other weapon, embodied that principle. Each bolt, each angle of armor plate, each liter of fuel carried inside was a solution to a specific question: how to survive longer than the man across the field. When American engineers finally examined the T-34 up close, its welded armor seams, its wide tracks, its crude but effective optics, they were both impressed and uneasy. Impressed because the Soviets had done so much with so little. Uneasy because it challenged assumptions that dominated Western military design for decades. At its heart, the T-34 was an equation of simplicity. A diesel engine, the V2, powered it, a 12-cylinder, 500-horsepower monster built from aluminum, not steel, because the Soviet Union lacked the industrial precision to mass-produce heavy engines like the Germans or Americans. Aluminum made it lighter, cooler, and resistant to catching fire when hit. Its wide tracks allowed it to float over mud and snow that bogged down German panzers and even the American Sherman. The armor was sloped, angled at 45 degrees on most surfaces, an elegant mathematical trick that turned 45 millimeters of steel into an effective thickness of nearly 80. By contrast, American designers approached the tank as a machine built for the long haul. The M4 Sherman was not a marvel of innovation, it was a masterpiece of consistency. Its radial aircraft engine, the Continental R975, was reliable and easy to maintain. Its parts were interchangeable across continents. If a Sherman broke down in the mud of Italy or the sands of North Africa, mechanics could strip another tank, ship, or aircraft to fix it. The T-34 could be repaired in a barn with a mechanic with a hammer and a wrench. The Sherman could be rebuilt by an army that lived on logistics. Both philosophies worked, but for entirely different wars. Then there was the Tiger. The German PZK-PF W6 Tiger I was an engineering marvel and an industrial tragedy. 88mm gun, impenetrable frontal armor, as thick as a man's chest and twice as hard. On paper, it was superior to everything the Allies fielded, but on the battlefield, its complexity was its enemy. The Tiger required constant maintenance, burned fuel like a locomotive, and often broke down before reaching combat. American engineers at Aberdeen compared it to a luxury car, precision-machined, over-engineered, fragile in the dirt. The T-34, they noted, was more like a farm tractor that refused to die. In controlled tests, the T-34's 76.2mm gun could penetrate 70 millimeters of armor at 500 meters. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun managed about the same, though with better optics and more predictable ammunition quality. Against a Tiger, both were inadequate unless firing from the flank. But tanks rarely fought duels in open plains. Terrain, tactics, and sheer numbers mattered more. In 1943, during the Battle of Kursk, Soviet factories produced
1,200 T-34s per month. Germany built fewer than 25 Tigers in that same time. Numbers turned theory into victory.
When American engineers tested the captured T-34-85, the upgraded version with an 85mm gun, they noted its balance had shifted. The turret was heavier, the front armor reinforced, but it remained light enough to maneuver. It wasn't perfect. The gun sights were crude, the welding uneven, and the transmission primitive. But it could kill a Panther from the side, and it could be built by the thousands. The Soviets had chosen evolution over perfection, iteration over innovation. Even the small details told a story. The T-34's air filters were poorly designed. In dusty conditions, engines wore out quickly. Soviet crews sometimes carried spare filters inside the tank, changing them mid-march. In comparison, the Sherman's filtration system was a marvel of foresight, designed for North Africa's sandstorms. The Germans, obsessed with precision tolerances, built filters so tight they clogged after a few hours. Every nation's engineers built for their environment, their resources, their imagined war. When the U.S. Army ordnance officers finished their evaluation reports in 1946, they noted something that would echo through decades. The T-34 represented an ideal compromise of firepower, mobility, and protection, achieved at the lowest possible cost. It was not the best tank in any single category, but it was good enough in all of them, and that made it deadly. The Americans took this lesson seriously. When the Korean War erupted in 1950 and North Korean T-34-85s rolled south, the U.S. suddenly faced its own creation's shadow. The M24 Chaffee and early M26 Pershings struggled. It was not until the M46 Patton, a tank built on the lessons learned from studying the T-34, that parity was restored. The T-34's influence extended beyond the battlefield. It altered the very way American engineers thought about design. Suddenly, efficiency mattered as much as excellence. The perfect machine was not the one that won the test range, but the one that could be built, repaired, and replaced faster than the enemy could destroy it. Under the hood, the V2 engine was a crude genius. It used aluminum pistons, steel liners, and relied on thick diesel fuel that didn't ignite easily under fire. The transmission, only 5 gears, was stubborn, heavy, and often broke under stress, but it worked. German engineers, when they first captured a T-34 near Smolensk in 1941, were stunned by its simplicity. "It is not a tank, it is a factory on tracks," one wrote. The American observers at Aberdeen said nearly the same thing 5 years later, though with a different tone, admiration mixed with disbelief. Armor was another field of philosophy. Soviet plates were cast or rolled with minimal machining. Their quality varied wildly, sometimes brittle, sometimes nearly indestructible. The Shermans, built with American precision, had consistent metallurgical properties and better welds, but thinner plates. Germans used the best steel in Europe, hardened and precisely angled, but their factories couldn't produce enough of it. Each approach mirrored the nation itself: Soviet endurance, American organization, German obsession. By the end of the war, the T-34 had gone through dozens of micro-evolutions, small changes, not radical redesigns. The Shermans, too, evolved, gaining thicker armor, better guns, and wet ammunition racks to prevent fires. The Tiger, by contrast, stagnated. Each tank was handcrafted, each slightly different, each a monument to wasted genius. When the U.S. engineers packed away the test reports in Aberdeen's archives, they may not have realized how prophetic their conclusions would become. The T-34 was not just a tank. It was a blueprint for how to fight a war when perfection is impossible. And in the atomic age, when strategy would shift from battlefields to production lines, that lesson mattered more than any armor thickness. It was the idea that victory came not from the best machine, but from the most adaptable one. War is fought by soldiers, but won by factories. No weapon, no matter how brilliant, survives the arithmetic of production. By 1943, the Second World War had become a contest of output,
where every rivet, every drum of fuel, every locomotive pulling freight was part of a greater equation. And in that equation, the tank was both a symbol and a sinkhole, a machine that consumed men, metal, and fuel faster than any other land weapon. The difference between winning and losing was not always measured in courage or tactics. Sometimes it was measured in tons of steel and hours on a production line. In the Soviet Union, the T-34 was not merely a tank. It was a strategy of survival forged in steel. When the German invasion began in June 1941, the USSR lost nearly 80% of its pre-war industrial base within months. Entire factories had to be dismantled, loaded onto trains, and shipped east of the Ural Mountains. It was one of the most extraordinary logistical feats in human history. Thousands of machines, hundreds of thousands of workers, and their families relocated while bombs fell around them. In those frozen rail yards, production of the T-34 continued almost uninterrupted. Workers lived inside unheated plants, welding by candlelight, wearing mittens in sub-zero temperatures. By 1942, the Soviets were producing over 1,200 T-34s a month. A single plant in Nizhny Tagil turned out more tanks than the entire German industry combined. The average T-34 rolled off the line in less than 4,000 man-hours, a figure unheard of in Germany, where a Tiger I required over 300,000 man-hours. Soviet factories prioritized quantity over perfection. Welding seams were rough, paint uneven, optics basic, but the philosophy was simple. A good tank today was better than a perfect one next year. In the United States, the approach was different but equally powerful. The arsenal of democracy had no need to move its factories, it built new ones. By 1944, the U.S. produced nearly 50,000 Shermans, an iron avalanche of standardized parts and trained labor. Ford's massive Willow Run plant in Michigan, originally designed for aircraft, could build a B-24 bomber in every 63 minutes and retool for tanks if needed. General Motors, Chrysler, and Fisher Body transformed car plants into tank assembly lines. The Sherman's design reflected that heritage. It was modular, interchangeable, and designed for mass assembly. The Sherman may not have been the most fearsome tank, but it was the most available. Spare parts could travel in the same crates as Jeep components or aircraft fittings. Mechanics could replace an engine in the field in less than a day. A Soviet tank brigade might cannibalize 2 damaged T-34s to keep one running. An American maintenance unit could keep dozens of Shermans operational indefinitely. This logistical depth, the invisible army of supply trains, tank transporters, and mobile depots, was the real steel backbone of Allied victory.
Germany, by contrast, drowned in its own engineering pride. Each Tiger tank required nearly 300,000 man-hours. Each Panther, 150,000. Parts were not standardized. Factories competed for limited materials, and Hitler's personal interference made things worse. In 1944, while Soviet plants were producing 1,500 T-34s a month, Germany built barely 60 Tigers. Their assembly lines were not lines at all, they were workshops. Skilled craftsmen, not assembly workers, built tanks by hand. Precision machining made them deadly, but also fragile in the face of strategic bombing. When the Allies destroyed a ball-bearing plant in Schweinfurt or an engine works in Kassel, entire production chains collapsed. Fuel was another invisible weapon. The T-34 ran on diesel, efficient and relatively safe to store. The Sherman used gasoline, abundant but highly flammable. German panzers drank a variety of fuels, diesel, gasoline, even synthetic blends derived from coal. But as the war dragged on, fuel itself became a luxury. By 1945, most German tanks were abandoned, not because they were destroyed, but because they simply ran out of fuel. Soviet and American armies advanced not just on courage, but on logistics. Railways rebuilt, convoys protected, pipelines laid across continents. The raw cost of production told the story in numbers. A T-34 cost roughly 135,000 rubles, about $40,000 in wartime value. A Sherman cost $45,000. A Panther, nearly $120,000. A Tiger, $300,000. For the price of one Tiger, the Soviets could build 6 T-34s, and the Americans could build 7 Shermans. On the battlefield, that math was merciless. A single Tiger might destroy 3 or 4 enemy tanks before being overwhelmed, but it could never be everywhere. Quantity had a quality all its own. Behind those numbers were people. In the Soviet Union, most factory workers were women, teenagers, and the elderly. Many worked 12 to 16-hour shifts under brutal conditions, sleeping beside the machines. In the U.S., it was the age of Rosie the Riveter. Millions of women entering industrial jobs for the first time, building engines, riveting armor plates, welding hulls. The war blurred lines between soldier and civilian. Each rivet was as vital as a bullet. Transportation networks reflected the same divide. The Soviets used rail lines as lifelines, moving tanks from the Urals to the front in endless convoys. Entire trains carried nothing but T-34s, dozens at a time, rolling through snow and smoke. American Shermans crossed oceans in Liberty ships, often arriving in Britain or North Africa faster than German tanks could reach the front by rail. Standardization made this possible. A Sherman engine built in Detroit could be installed in a tank assembled in California and shipped to Normandy. Even maintenance philosophy differed. Soviet manuals encouraged field improvisation. Hammer the gears back into place, weld cracks with whatever metal was available, patch armor with scrap. American manuals taught procedure, replace, not repair, document each fault, follow each diagram. German manuals demanded precision, the right torque, the exact calibration, the perfect fit. One system survived chaos, another thrived in order, the third collapsed under both.
As the war turned against Germany, Hitler demanded wonder weapons. New tanks, new guns, new miracles. The Panther was one such miracle, born of panic after the shock of facing the T-34 in 1941. It was fast, deadly, but rushed into battle before its flaws were fixed. Engines caught fire, transmissions shattered, and logistics choked. The T-34 was never a wonder weapon. It didn't need to be. It was the tank of reality, not imagination. American observers studying Soviet production after the war were stunned by its efficiency. The Nizhny Tagil factory, known as Uralvagonzavod, could complete a tank every 30 minutes at peak output. Crews moved like clockwork, each step timed, each material rationed. Quality control was brutal. If a part didn't fit, it was hammered until it did. But the result worked. It rolled, it fought, it killed, and it could be replaced tomorrow. When peace returned and the smoke of war cleared, economists examined the figures. The Soviet Union had produced over 84,000 T-34s. The United States, over 49,000 Shermans. Germany, fewer than 6,000 Panthers and 1,300 Tigers. The numbers were not just statistics. They were philosophy in metal. The T-34 was the victory of pragmatism, the Sherman of logistics, the Tiger of lost perfection. The legacy of those production philosophies shaped the Cold War. The Soviets continued to build in massive quantities, T-54s, T-62s, later T-72s, all evolutions of the same practical DNA. The United States, now with limitless industrial power, shifted toward technology and precision, leading to the M60, the Abrams, the rise of electronics and fire control systems. But beneath it all, one lesson remained. Wars are won by what you can build, not by what you can imagine. In the ruins of German cities, amid twisted steel and shattered machinery, American and Soviet officers sometimes walked together through captured factories. They saw the remnants of an empire that had built the best tanks in the world, and too few of them. One Soviet officer reportedly remarked, "You build too little, too late." The American simply nodded. It was a truth written in smoke and numbers. By the end of 1945, the tank had become more than a weapon. It was an index of national will. The T-34 was the will to endure. The Sherman, the will to organize. The Tiger, the will to dominate. Only one of those could survive total war.
A tank is a machine built for killing, but it is also a small world of men trapped inside steel. Its design dictates not only how it fights, but how its crew lives, breathes, and dies. On the factory floor, the T-34, the Sherman, and the Tiger were numbers and blueprints. On the battlefield, they became coffins, homes, and instruments of survival. What separated them was not only armor and guns, but the human experience sealed behind the hatch. Inside the T-34, conditions were brutal. The interior was cramped, barely enough room for the 4 or 5 men who crewed it. There was no lining on the walls. Bare steel amplified every sound, every impact. When the gun fired, the shock wave reverberated through the hull, rattling teeth and bones. Diesel fumes hung in the air, mixing with cordite and sweat. There was no ventilation, no comfort. In summer, it was an oven. In winter, a freezer. Communication was by shouting. Many early T-34s lacked radios altogether, forcing commanders to use flags or hand signals in the middle of battle. Yet, Soviet crews learned to adapt. They fought in conditions that would have paralyzed better-equipped armies. They slept on the tank's hull, cooked meals on the engine deck, and shared one canteen among 5 men. Maintenance was constant and improvisational. A jammed turret was fixed with a hammer. A damaged track was welded with scrap metal. The tank became both weapon and shelter, a piece of home in a world of chaos. Crews gave them names: Alyosha, Katusha, Avenger. Each tank, identical in production, became unique through survival. American crews lived differently. The M4 Sherman was designed with the man in mind. It had better ergonomics, padded seats, more space, and smoother controls. Radios were standard, allowing coordination and flexibility. The engine was loud but reliable, and crews trusted it to start even after long marches. The tank's hatches were designed for quick escape. Many lives were saved by that simple detail. There was a sense of industrial comfort, everything in its place, every tool accessible. But comfort did not mean safety. The Sherman's gasoline engine and thin side armor made it notorious among its crews. When hit, the fuel often ignited, turning the tank into an inferno within seconds. Germans nicknamed it the Tommy Cooker. American soldiers called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter whose slogan was, "Lights every time." Later models introduced wet ammunition storage, shells surrounded by water jackets to prevent explosions, and this reduced the fatality rate dramatically. Still, the fear of burning alive haunted every tanker. German crews, by comparison, lived inside machines of engineering perfection and existential dread. The Tiger's interior was spacious, with fine optics, leather seats, and efficient ventilation. Its commander's cupola gave a panoramic view of the battlefield, and its gun sights were among the best in the world. But luxury came with a curse. Every mission carried the risk of mechanical failure. A broken transmission or clogged filter could immobilize a tank miles from help. Crews often spent more time repairing than fighting. When the Tiger moved, all eyes were on it, friend and foe alike. Its reputation made it a priority target for artillery and aircraft.
Psychologically, tank warfare was claustrophobic and isolating. Once sealed inside, a crew saw only fragments of the world through periscopes, slits, and narrow optics. Noise was constant, engines roaring, guns thundering, the scream of ricochets. When armor was hit, the sound was like a hammer on a bell. Even if the shell didn't penetrate, the concussion could knock men unconscious. A single breach turned the compartment into hell, spalling fragments slicing through flesh, fire flooding the interior, ammunition cooking off. Survival depended on seconds and instinct. The human relationship with the machine was complicated. Crews spoke of their tanks as comrades, living things with tempers and moods. American gunner Clarence Smoyer of the 3rd Armored Division once said, "When you fight in it long enough, the tank becomes part of you. You feel its heartbeat." Soviet veteran Dmitry Lavrenenko, one of the highest-scoring tank aces of the war, described his T-34 as a beast that obeys but never forgives. German ace Michael Wittmann, whose Tiger destroyed dozens of Allied vehicles, treated his machine with religious care. In each army, the tank reflected the man, and the man reflected the tank. Maintenance defined survival. Soviet mechanics carried only basic tools, yet they performed miracles under fire. Engines swapped in open fields, gearboxes repaired in the mud. The T-34's simplicity made it possible. American maintenance was systematic. Mobile workshops, recovery vehicles, and trained engineers followed armored divisions wherever they went. A damaged Sherman could be hauled back, fixed, and returned to battle within days. German maintenance was precise but slow. Spare parts were scarce. Towing a disabled Tiger required multiple vehicles. Often crews destroyed their own tanks to prevent capture. Combat experience changed how each army viewed its machines. Soviet doctrine emphasized shock and mass. T-34s attacked in waves, dozens at a time, overwhelming defenses by sheer momentum. Losses were staggering, but production replaced what bravery consumed. Crews went into battle knowing many would not return. It bred a fatalistic courage, a belief that survival was chance, not skill. American tactics favored coordination, tanks working with infantry, artillery, and air support. The Sherman was part of a system, not a lone hero. It might lose a duel, but it rarely fought alone. German tankers fought like hunters. The Tiger and Panther excelled at ambushes, long-range engagements, precision strikes, but they were few, and every loss was irreplaceable. A German crew might destroy 10 enemy tanks and still lose the war. For all their skill and confidence, they were trapped by arithmetic. Inside a tank, death was personal. When a shell penetrated, it brought the outside world in. A flash, a scream, then silence. Survivors described the smell: oil, smoke, burning paint, and something worse. Yet, despite the horror, morale often remained high. Tank crews developed tight bonds. They lived, fought, and sometimes died together. Trust was absolute. The driver had to feel the commander's intent. The gunner had to sense when the next round was coming. In that space of steel and fire, teamwork was not a concept, it was survival.
Camaraderie often crossed borders. After the war, American and Soviet veterans met at memorials and compared stories. Both laughed about frozen engines, broken gearboxes, and the endless mud. They had lived the same life, only in different languages. One Soviet tanker, when shown a Sherman at a reunion, patted its armor and said, "She looks comfortable." The American beside him smiled. "Yeah," he said, "until she catches fire." The battlefield left its mark not only on the men, but on the machines themselves. Burned-out hulls littered Europe from the steppes to Normandy. Farmers plowed around them for decades. Children played in their shadows. Each wreck was a silent witness, a monument to the limits of engineering and the endurance of flesh. In the end, all tanks failed the same way. Fire ignored design. Steel melted the same under heat, no matter who built it. Crews bled the same color, prayed the same prayers. Yet the differences in how those tanks were built, how they were maintained, how they protected or betrayed their crews, defined how nations remembered them. The T-34 became a symbol of sacrifice and resilience. On the front lines, it was a workhorse, ugly, loud, and simple, yet relentless. Propaganda reinforced this image. Posters depicted T-34s rolling over enemy positions, unstoppable and inexhaustible. Soviet citizens were told that each tank represented the nation itself, strong, adaptable, and willing to sacrifice in the face of overwhelming odds. Veterans would recall the T-34 not just as a vehicle, but as a partner, a beast that shared in every hardship of the battlefield. In museums and memorials today, the T-34 still carries the weight of that mythology, symbolizing endurance over elegance. The Sherman, for Americans and Allies, became a symbol of industrial power and teamwork. While it was not invincible, its strength lay in numbers and reliability. Stories circulated of Shermans being repaired in the field and returning to action, of brigades of tanks coordinating with infantry, artillery, and air cover. The Sherman represented the American approach to war, a system where coordination, logistics, and adaptability mattered more than individual heroics. In the post-war era, the Sherman also became a teaching tool, a reminder that war is won not just by elite warriors, but by the efficiency and reach of an entire society.
German tanks, particularly the Tiger, achieved a mythic status almost immediately. Their appearance on the battlefield instilled fear, even among seasoned Allied crews. Stories of single Tigers destroying dozens of enemy vehicles were often exaggerated, but the legend endured. German propaganda framed them as superior engineering and technical perfection. while soldiers and civilians alike saw them as symbols of might and intimidation. After the war, the Tiger would inspire generations of engineers, modelers, and historians, even as its operational flaws and strategic impracticalities became more apparent. The myth outlasted the reality. Perception also shaped post-war politics. In the Soviet Union, the T-34 was celebrated as a national achievement. Statues, commemorative coins, and films immortalized its image. It became part of a collective memory, a symbol that every Soviet citizen could understand. The T-34 was what kept the nation alive. In the United States, the Sherman story was told less through glamour and more through pragmatism. It exemplified how industry and coordination could overcome brute force. In Germany, the Tiger became a cautionary tale, a story of brilliance constrained by circumstance, and a potent reminder of how technical perfection can be a double-edged sword. The myths were not only external, they shaped soldiers' behavior. Soviet crews often believed that a T-34 could absorb incredible punishment and kept fighting despite catastrophic damage. Sherman crews relied on doctrine and coordination, trusting that if one tank failed, others would take its place. German crews of Tigers and Panthers were conscious of their machines' strengths and fragility, often treating each mission with a mixture of confidence and apprehension. These perceptions influenced tactics, morale, and ultimately survival. After the war, the mythologies persisted, shaping military thinking for decades. NATO armies studied the T-34 to understand how mass production and simplicity could outperform technical sophistication. Soviet engineers evolved the T-34's design into the T-54 and T-55, continuing the philosophy of rugged, easily produced armor. American tank programs, influenced by the Sherman experience, emphasized logistical integration and crew survivability. German tank designers, scattered and constrained, inspired post-war armored programs in other nations, though rarely reproducing the complexity of the Panther or Tiger at scale. The symbolic power of these tanks also affected culture and memory. Films, literature, and games immortalized them. The T-34 became a hero's machine in Soviet cinema. The Sherman represented the industrious, reliable ally in American media. The Tiger became the ultimate foe, awe-inspiring and terrifying. Museums around the world exhibit them not merely as historical artifacts, but as narrative anchors, machines through which people interpret war, heroism, and national identity.
Ultimately, perception and myth proved that tanks are not only physical weapons, but cultural ones. A single T-34 rolling across the steppe in 1943 carried the hopes of an entire army. A Sherman convoy moving through the Ardennes signaled the reach of American industry. A Tiger perched on a hill in Normandy could freeze an infantry advance through sheer reputation alone. These stories shaped decision-making, morale, and historical memory. Tanks, then, were not just tools of war. They were symbols of human ingenuity, endurance, and imagination. The conclusion of World War II did not end the lessons learned on tank battlefields. It merely expanded them. The T-34, Sherman, and Tiger left indelible marks on military doctrine, engineering practices, and strategic thought. Their legacy shaped Cold War armored forces, influenced modern tank design, and taught armies what works in war and what does not. The Soviet Union, having witnessed the effectiveness of mass production and mechanical simplicity, continued to prioritize these principles. The T-54 and T-55 were direct evolutions of the T-34 philosophy: robust, easy to manufacture, easy to maintain, and adaptable to a wide range of conditions. Soviet doctrine favored overwhelming numbers, deep reserves, and resilience over technological finesse. The T-34's lessons were institutionalized. Every subsequent Soviet tank reflected the belief that a good tank produced quickly and in quantity could outlast the technically superior but rare machine. The United States, emerging from industrial supremacy, emphasized integration, logistics, and crew protection.
Post-war designs, from the M26 Pershing to the M60 Patton and later the M1 Abrams, emphasized survivability, firepower, and coordination within a combined arms framework. The Sherman had taught American planners that a tank must fit into a system, not operate alone. Industrial capacity, standardization, and operational doctrine remained the pillars of American armored warfare. Germany's lessons were more complex. While its engineers had achieved technical brilliance with the Panther and Tiger, they had failed to align engineering with strategy and production. Post-war German and European armored programs absorbed these lessons, producing machines that balanced firepower, protection, and mobility with the realities of industrial capacity. NATO's Leopard tanks, for example, demonstrated that German engineering could be married to rational production practices, avoiding the fragility that had doomed the wartime Tiger. Beyond the technical, the legacy of these tanks affected military thought. The concept of mobility, mechanical simplicity, and combined arms doctrine became central to modern armored doctrine. Lessons about crew survivability, ergonomics, and field maintenance were codified in manuals, training programs, and design specifications. Modern armies understood that a tank is not only a gun on tracks, it is a system of people, machines, logistics, and strategy.
Culturally, the T-34, Sherman, and Tiger continue to resonate. Museums, movies, and literature preserve their stories. Historical studies compare numbers, armor thickness, and tactical impact. Wargamers, model builders, and historians debate their merits endlessly. Yet the ultimate lesson is less about which tank was better and more about how nations fight war. The T-34 teaches endurance and adaptability. The Sherman teaches coordination and logistics. The Tiger warns of over-engineered perfection divorced from production reality. Even today, armored vehicles reflect those lessons. Engineers design with manufacturability in mind. Militaries train crews not just to operate the machine, but to maintain it, understand its limitations, and integrate it into larger systems. Every modern tank, from the T-90 to the Abrams and Leopard 2, carries echoes of the World War II experience. The balance of firepower, mobility, protection, and human factors that determined life or death decades ago. In the end, the T-34, Sherman, and Tiger were more than metal and mechanics. They were crucibles of strategy, engineering, and human endurance. They shaped battles, won wars, and created myths that continue to teach, inspire, and caution. Their stories remind us that machines alone do not fight wars, people do, and the machines they build reflect the values, resources, and philosophies of the societies that produce them. War leaves behind steel and smoke, but it also leaves lessons. The tanks of World War II are not merely relics, they are teachers, and those who study them, whether engineers, soldiers, or historians, learn that victory depends not on the might of one tank, but on the wisdom of a nation to produce, maintain, and deploy its machines in harmony with strategy, logistics, and human courage.